So today we'll be discussing constructing gender and sexuality. And so when we talk about sex, we're referring to an individual's biological makeup. Does that person biologically fit the category of male or female? This is based on one's genetic or anatomic sex. And when we use the term genetic sex, we're talking about one's chromosomal and hormonal sex characteristics. So what type of chromosomes does their body produce? Or does their body consist of? Is it an XY combination? Is it an XX combination? Does their hormonal system produce estrogen? Or does it produce testosterone at a higher rate? And then we look at anatomical sex. And anatomical sex refers to physical sex. Does the individual's body contain a uterus, or a vulva, or a vagina, or a penis, or a testes? When we look at sex, remember, sex is biological. And on the exam, there is going to be a question about sex. Is it biological or is it socially constructed? Socially constructed through culture. And as you're looking through the exam, you're going to say, hold up. Sex is biological because it has to deal with the genetic and anatomical makeup of an individual. We oftentimes hear individuals using the term sex and the term gender as if they're interchangeable. And that's incredibly irresponsible because they mean two distinctly different things. Gender is not the same as biological sex because sex is rooted in biology and gender is rooted in culture. When we talk about gender, we're talking about what does society or culture deem to be masculine? What does society or culture deem to be feminine? And what are the different social and cultural characteristics that society places on those who identify as masculine or those who identify as feminine? We're going to discuss this a little more as we progress through this lecture. But let's start covering this concept of assigned gender. And assigned gender is essentially what is the gender that is given to us typically at birth. Think about what occurs when a baby is born. The doctor, the nurse, holds up the baby and says, "Congratulations, it's a boy. Congratulations, it's a girl." Well, what do they base that assessment on? Well, very limited information. They're primarily looking at the genitalia. Does the baby have a vulva? Does the baby have, or a vagina? Or does the baby have a penis? But think about what that label does when you say, "Congratulations, it's a boy. Congratulations, it's a girl." That label transforms that baby to a male or to a female. And with that assignment comes with it all these social and cultural expectations. Now people start treating or behaving differently towards the baby. Now we start to associate different colors with the baby. For example, if it's a boy, people generally associate the color blue. If it's a girl, people will generally associate the color pink. And so start thinking about how our interactions shape when we label a baby male or female. And as you're thinking about that, let's talk about gender identity. And when we use the term gender identity, we're talking about a person's internal sense of being female or male. The person physically and biologically may have the characteristics of a male, but internally, within one's own mind, they may not necessarily feel comfortable with identifying as a male because they identify as female, and vice versa. This idea of individuals not feeling comfortable with, not being able to identify consistently with their biological makeup leads an individual to identify as transgender. Now, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time discussing the transgender community or the LGBT community in general in this particular lecture. But I want you to understand that when it comes to gender identity, there's oftentimes that discussion that people have saying, I just don't understand why someone is transgender. And I want to make this abundantly clear. For those of us who identify as heterosexual, we have enjoyed and benefited from a heteronormative society. And what that means essentially is that as heterosexuals, we are the majority of the population. A majority of our interactions, a majority of what we see on television, a majority of what we see in general society is from the heterosexual perspective. It's not our job to fully understand how someone can be gay or lesbian or bisexual or transgender, because it's going to be difficult to understand looking at it from a heterosexual perspective. But if we take a step back and we suspend gender identity and we suspend our heterosexual privilege and we adopt the sociological perspective where we enter new situations as a blank canvas and we allow that experience to paint a picture for itself, well, that's how we're going to gain a greater understanding of what it means to be transgender. And I hope that makes sense. This idea that we have to suspend our privilege if we want to understand what it means to be transgender, what it means to be gay, what it means to be lesbian or bisexual within our society today. And until we're prepared to suspend our heterosexual privilege, we will never truly gain a strong understanding. Now, one of the other things that I want to touch on in relation to what it means to be transgender is that individuals will argue, well, I don't understand how that could be possible. Well, once again, you're not going to understand from your heterosexual perspective, but that does not necessarily mean you cannot be an ally. You can still support individuals who are transgender. You can still support individuals who are gay, lesbian, and bisexual. And so I want to stress that because think about the challenges, and we'll discuss this later on when we cover sexual orientation. But think about the challenges that an individual who is transgender or gay or lesbian or bisexual faces on a daily basis. In a society that is still prejudicial, in a society that is still relatively ignorant and will make foolish statements. Let's keep it real. You may have a friend, you may have a family member who identifies as transgender. Let's say that the individual was born female and at the age of 17 years old said, you know what? My identity is not consistent with my biological makeup. I identify as a male. You should show that person respect and refer to them by their male name, by his male name. It's incredibly disrespectful when people say, well, I know that you're identifying as male now, but I'm still going to refer to you as your female name. And this is where education comes into play. I'm not talking about education necessarily in a formal classroom, but just educating ourselves to realize, what if I was in that position? How would I want to be treated? And so I just wanted to have that little brief discussion on gender identity. And we'll touch on this later on in this course. We look at gender roles. And gender roles are typically attitudes, behaviors, the rights, the responsibilities that particular groups associate with an assumed or assigned sex. Think about the gender role expectations that we apply to women. Think about the gender role expectations that we apply to men. Think about how those gender role expectations can be incredibly limiting. And what I mean by that is, think about how many women in our society have been discouraged from pursuing an education. Think about how many women in our society have been discouraged from pursuing a particular occupation for the simple fact that they are female. Think about how in our families, and maybe we grew up in a more traditional family. As a daughter, you could be sitting there doing your homework, studying hard for an exam, and your mom or your dad calls you into the kitchen and says, hey, you need to set the table. Hey, you need to help make dinner. Right? And you're looking at the situation saying, I was studying, I was doing homework. My brother's sitting on the couch right there watching TV, playing a video game. Why can't he help? Well, I want to teach you how to be a good wife. You need to learn how to cook, because what man will want you if you can't cook? Well, I flipped the script on that. I would then look at my parent if they were to propose such an ideology. And I would say, well, why can't my brother cook? Right? He's going to have to eat. If he has a family one day, there's going to come a point where he's going to have to cook for his family. But these gender roles at times may marry individuals to very restrictive interpretations of what it means to be a male, what it means to be a female, what is considered appropriate and inappropriate behavior for a male or female to engage in. And we'll discuss gender roles later on as well. Think about gender role stereotype. And these are rigidly held, oversimplified, and overgeneralized beliefs about how each gender should behave. The idea that women should be feminine, that men should be masculine. Well, what does that mean? In my opinion, it's total nonsense. Because to adopt what it means to be masculine, to adopt what it means to be feminine, is incredibly restrictive. And it deprives us of the opportunity at times to just be ourselves. I don't know how many of you enjoy the Fast and the Furious movies. Fast and the Furious movies are typically action-packed, are typically geared towards a male audience. It's supposed to be like the epitome of masculinity, right? Action, violence, fast cars, attractive women. I don't like the Fast and Furious movies. If you ask me, hey, what movie should I watch? I'd probably say something like Something Borrowed, The Devil Wears Prada. I like those type of romantic comedies. Does that make me less masculine? Well, maybe to some in society, yes. But our masculinity should not be defined by whether or not we watch a particular type of movie, whether or not we shed a tear when we're watching A Walk to Remember starring Mandy Moore. Our masculinity, our femininity should not be restricted to specific gender role stereotypes, because these stereotypes can lead to false and misleading statements, interpretations. They can lead us to cause damage to an individual and an individual's sense of self. Think about it. You have fathers and mothers at times that say, big boys don't cry. And then we wonder why men can't express themselves. Well, they grew up in a society that said, suppress your emotions, that emotions are weakness. But there's nothing wrong with crying. Now, if you're crying all the time, that's a different story. But there's nothing wrong with crying. There's nothing wrong with expressing yourself. But any form of expression is typically labeled as feminine. Once again, very limited perspective. What we want to understand is that because gender is culturally constructed, it is actually a combination of the interaction of biological forces, of cultural forces, and of psychosocial components. And when we use biological, recall, we're talking about genetic and anatomical sex. When we're talking about culture, we're talking about gender distinctions. We're talking about gender roles, for example, definitions of what it means to be masculine, definitions of what it means to be feminine. And when we talk about psychosocial, we're talking about the impact of assigned gender, the impact of gender identity. And on the exam, word for word, I'm literally going to copy and paste this example. And what you see in parentheses, I'm going to ask you to fill that out. So as you're taking the exam, remember this, BCPS. Because if a person looks like a girl, well, that's typically biological. If the person believes she should be feminine, well, that's cultural. Feels as if she is a girl, that is psychosocial. And acts like a girl, whatever that means, that is social. Then we argue that that individual's gender identity and gender role are congruent or consistent with their anatomical sex. And so you want to keep this example in mind because, like I stated a little while ago, word for word, this will be on the exam. And this will also be on the quiz for this week. Now, what we want to understand about American culture and what is recognized typically by the government is that our culture emphasizes that there are only two genders and that these genders should experience some level of coherence among the biological, cultural, psychosocial, and social dimensions that are associated with each gender. But what we know is that in subculture, multiple genders may exist. A person's identity may vary and be different than the traditional male-female label. We look at this concept of gender variations. And gender variations occur when there's an absence of coherence among the dimensions of each gender. In other words, a person deviates from fulfilling all the requirements of the biological factors, all the requirements of the cultural factors, all the requirements of the psychosocial or social dimensions of each gender. Individuals may take bits and pieces of these dimensions, but may not subscribe 100% to them. When we talk about gender variant, that's individual specific. And gender variants are individuals who say, I cannot or I choose not to conform to societal definitions of gender norms that are typically associated with a biological sex. I understand what society is saying, and I refuse to go along with the stereotypical definitions of gender roles or gender norms that society is promoting. As we mentioned before, this concept of assigned gender and how it's assigned based on our anatomical appearance. The idea that assigned gender is significant because it tells others how they should respond to us. The idea that as young children, we really don't know what it means to be male or female. We don't understand the complexities of those labels. But as we progress through life and gain new life experiences, we begin to understand that we are a boy or a girl. And the expectations associated with being a boy and a girl based on the verbal responses and signals that others provide us about our gender. So the way people dress us, the haircuts we receive, how people interact with us, that helps us develop our sense of self and our understanding of the role of gender in our everyday interactions, in our place in society. Think about it. By the age of 2 years old, we're able to identify ourselves as either a boy or a girl based on what other people have told us. We may begin to associate females with mommy and males with daddy. We may not really understand why we're a boy. We may not really understand why we're a girl, but we typically, at this point, are building that sense of self based on what significant others have told us about what it means to be a boy or a girl. Now, we do not, at the age of 2 years old, associate our gender typically with our genitalia. Then by age of 3, we start to see individuals starting to gain a stronger understanding of what it means to be a boy or girl based on clothing that they wear, based on the hairstyles that they may be having. And at the age of 3, that's when we start to learn about the role of genitalia or genitals in identifying as a male or female. And then 4 or 5, typically when we enter preschool or kindergarten, is really when we start to understand the wide array of gender role and social stereotypes about behaviors and the association of those behaviors with how we're supposed to interact with others. Now, as I mentioned before, when we talk about gender identity, right, this feeling of femaleness, this feeling of maleness in our gender identity is our gender identity. Gender identity is permanent. And for most individuals, one's gender identity is congruent with one's sexual anatomy and assigned gender. And those individuals who do not have a gender identity that is congruent or consistent with their anatomy, not consistent with their assigned gender, well, those individuals, as we mentioned before, identify as transgender. We look at gender expression. And gender expression refers to how we express our gender identity. How do we dress? What's the length of our hair? Do we wear makeup? Think about the way we act or the way we speak. And I want you to think about this. Why is it, and this is going to tie into our discussion in a little bit, but why is it that women in society today are encouraged to wear makeup, yet men are not necessarily encouraged to wear makeup? If a man wears makeup, it's seen as less masculine, that the man has more feminine tendencies. And I want you to think about that because we're going to revisit that concept, that idea, when we start talking about sexism and misogyny. But I want you to think about it. Why is it that in our society today, there's a cultural expectation that women will wear makeup, and there's a cultural expectation that in most cases, men will not wear makeup? Look at this idea of gender nonconforming. And gender nonconforming basically means that people are refusing to follow other people's ideas or stereotypes about how they should look, how they should act, based on their female male sex that they were assigned at birth. Basically, I know what society tells me a man's supposed to be. I know what society tells me a female is supposed to be, but I'm going to reject that. And then we talked about transgender and the transgender community. As we mentioned before, an identity that is not congruent with the sex that was assigned at birth. And also the idea that to be transgender, society today is still considered to be taboo, because our society evaluates what it means to be transgender, seeks to understand what it means to be transgender based on a heteronormative perspective, a heterosexual privilege perspective. And then we're going to look at what are the factors that influence our gender role learning. During infancy and childhood, think about who some of the most powerful socializing agents are. Parents. There are primary caregivers. And parents need to be aware that their words and their actions do have an impact on a child's gender role socialization. Parents need to be aware that they do treat their sons and daughters differently because of their gender, and they need to make adjustments to that treatment to develop a more equitable treatment within the household of their sons and daughters, because that can have a lasting impact on the identity of their son or their daughter. We look at manipulation, for example. And parents may manipulate their children from infancy onward. They may treat their daughters gently, tell her she's pretty, advise her that nice girls do not fight. As opposed to their son, they may be a little more rough. They tell him he's strong. They advise him that big boys don't cry. And then we look at channeling. And the idea that children are channeled to specific objects. And what we mean by that is think about how children are pushed to different toys based on their sex. The idea that dolls are considered feminine, therefore, we're going to push our daughter towards dolls. Cars and trucks are considered masculine, therefore, we're going to push our sons towards cars and trucks. Well, why is that? For the females in this class who have older siblings, primarily older siblings who are male, my guess is that there's a strong possibility that you probably grew up playing with toys that have traditionally been labeled boy toys. Does that have an effect on your sexual orientation? Because that's the fear that a lot of people have. They think that if a boy plays with a doll, oh my gosh, he's going to become gay. Well, that's not how it works. Playing with a toy has nothing to do with who you are attracted to. Playing with the toy should be interpreted as playing with a toy. That's all. If your daughter wants to play in the mud and wants to have Nerf gun wars and wants to play with trucks, nothing wrong with that. If your son wants to play with dolls, if your son wants to, have one of those Fisher Price houses or have a collection of stuffed animals, there's nothing wrong with that. But it requires us to break away from gender role stereotypes and stereotypes associated with what type of toys boys should be playing with and what type of toys girls should be playing with. We look at verbal appellation and how parents use different words with boys and girls to describe the same type of behavior. A boy who pushes others can be seen as, well, he's just active. It's just a boy being a boy. If a girl does the same, well, she's being aggressive. She's not being ladylike. And then we look at what type of activities our boys and girls are exposed to. Boys may be discouraged from imitating their mothers, right? Be a man, go cut the lawn, go take out the garbage, whatever it may be. Go use your hands. Girls, well, they're encouraged to be mommy's little helper. And we're talking about more traditional households that subscribe to these stereotypical gender roles. Now, we leave the household, we enter a school environment. And most elementary school teachers, not all, but most, identify as female. And so we start to interact with these teachers, these female teachers, and we start to assume that femininity is associated with child caring or child care. That femininity is associated with children, and that women are better suited, according to this gender role stereotype, to care for children than men are. Well, that's not 100% true. That's a stereotype that exists within our society. And think about what occurs in elementary schools. I taught elementary school for 2 years. When you have a male teacher who's teaching kindergarten, this is where our prejudices come into play. Parents may be more skeptical about a male kindergarten teacher than they are about a female kindergarten teacher. Now they're looking and saying, is that guy a pedophile? Because why would a guy want to teach kindergartners? Well, maybe he likes teaching, and maybe that's his preferred group to teach. Well, think about that. We typically don't associate children with masculinity. We typically associate children with femininity. Think about how teachers may reinforce these gender role stereotypes. Think about the type of activities that they assign to boys, contact sports, for example, and what type of activities they assign to girls. Think about the reinforcement of these stereotypes when it comes to academics. That teachers may ask more complicated mathematical questions to boys and encourage females to read more, to write more. Teachers reinforce at times these stereotypes, and it's important for teachers to acknowledge the fact that sometimes their behaviors do reinforce these stereotypes and they need to address them effectively. I'm going to take a moment and let you guys read through this particular slide on the impact of peers and peer pressure as socializing agents, and then we'll start to discuss this. So I want you to reflect on your childhood years and think about that impact of peer pressure. Think about how your friends influence the type of games you play, what you wear, what type of music you listen to, what type of television shows you watch. Think about even their impact on the type of cereal you may eat. Peers are oftentimes, if you recall previous discussions, a reference group. They shape our behaviors. And think about our perceptions of what our friends believe to be gender role, or what our friends believe and their attitudes towards gender roles, gender role behaviors. And think about how they begin to shape our understanding of what it means to be masculine or feminine. Well, it's largely based on how your friend was socialized. Was your friend socialized in an environment that was very restrictive, that was very traditional in gender role definitions, that subscribed to gender role stereotypes? Or did your friend grow up in a household that challenged those gender role stereotypes? Think about the type of activities and toys that our peers play with. And what I mean by that is, think about video games that capture kids' attention, particularly male students or male children. Video games. I tried to get Gavin this game for, I think it was the 3DS or whatever, that taught him how to, read and letters and math, and it was like Sesame Street. He didn't want to play it. He'd prefer to play Fortnite. He'd prefer to play Overwatch. Violence in games. The focus on win, 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 win. Conquering. And then think about going back to the toys that are oftentimes forced upon young girls. Dolls that cry, dolls that wet themselves. The idea that we're teaching boys that winning is the most important thing, and we're teaching young girls through the toys that they play with to be reactive, right? Respond to the needs of another. Be caring, right? Nothing wrong with being caring, but there's no reason why a boy can't be caring too. Think about how through verbal approval or verbal disapproval, how that can begin to influence our behavior. That's for boys. Only girls do that. And how that can affect us. Think about the media. Think about how television and video programming can promote negative stereotypes about gender and ethnicity and age and ability, and even sexual orientation. The idea that when we flip on the television, when we turn on the television, you typically see women who are under the age of 30, who are well groomed, who are thin, and who are attractive. Once they pass 30 years old, all of a sudden they're 31 and they're playing the role of a mother to like a 15-year-old son or daughter. It's absurd. If she's over 30, think about all the actresses that you see on television that are above the age of 30 years old. Chances are you can only name a handful because a vast majority are in their mid to late 20s. Now think about male characters on television or in movies. They're aggressive, they're constructive, they solve problems at times, they rescue you from danger, right? And it seems like there's no expiration date for male characters. That's become the norm, like in Modern Family, to have an older man. Granted, Sofia Vergara is older than 30 years old, but to have an older man with a younger woman. But you flip the script and now you have an older woman with a younger man, and now everyone's talking about it because it's so scandalous. I encourage you to look at this video whenever you can about kids' assumption of gender roles. And what this video does is that it promotes the social experiments where kids are asked to draw a medical doctor, kids are asked to draw a fighter pilot, kids are asked to draw a firefighter. In a majority of cases, kids drew men in those occupations. And what's really cool about this video is that they have females walk out who are who's a female who's a firefighter, a female who's a fighter pilot, a female who's a medical doctor, a surgeon. And they challenge these stereotypes. And kids are shocked because the way we've been socialized as a society is to assume that males occupy those occupations. And so I encourage you to check it out. It's a really, really cool short video. Think about how our culture determines the content of gender roles in its own way. That cultural norms will fluctuate and change with time and across cultures. The idea that biology creates a male or female, but it's culture that creates concepts of masculinity. It's culture that creates concepts of femininity. And what we want to understand about Western culture in particular is that we're made to believe that men and women are polar opposites, aka the opposite sex. The idea that men should be aggressive, women should be passive. Men are task-oriented and women are expressive and emotion-oriented. That men are rational and women are irrational. That men want sex and women want love. This is total bullshit. Because women could just want sex. They might just want to hit it and quit it, and that's it. And men might say, you know what, I want a fulfilling relationship before I engage in any type of sexual activity. It's absurd to think that men are rational, women are irrational, because I'm sure many women know very irrational men. I'm sure many men know very rational women. The idea that women are supposed to be expressive, well, a man can be expressive too, and there's nothing wrong with that. And a woman can be task-oriented, and there's nothing wrong with that either. It depends on how we've been socialized. It depends on what we have been taught is appropriate or inappropriate behaviors that have been assigned to males and females. Think about changes that are occurring to gender role stereotypes and gender stereotypes in general. Think about how many women have now entered the workforce and are now working in occupations that were previously prescribed to men. And how it's forced society to rethink gender roles. What we want to understand is that female stereotypes are fluid, they're constantly changing. But male stereotypes haven't changed much, they're still incredibly limited. And so you want to think about that. How do we begin to rewrite that script? To be more inclusive of females and to add more diversity in the gender role associated with being male. Now, what we want to understand is that gender identity, and gender roles are conceptually independent of sexual orientation. People automatically assume that gender identity, gender roles are somehow tied to sexual orientation. That's not necessarily true. What we want to understand about homosexuality in particular is that homosexuality is typically not associated with femininity or masculinity from people who have a very closed-minded perspective on what it means to be masculine or feminine. Because people typically associate masculinity and femininity with heterosexuality. But we want to understand that a gay male, a lesbian female can be masculine, can be feminine. That it is not exclusive to the heterosexual community. And that to assume that it is exclusive to the heterosexual community is to engage and to adopt stereotypes of heterosexuality, to adopt stereotypes of homosexuality. See, some people in our society prescribe to this idea, these assumptions, that if a man is gay, he cannot be masculine. If a woman is lesbian, she cannot be feminine. That is total BS. Some people in our society will subscribe to this notion that if a man is gay, he must have some type of feminine characteristic. If a woman is lesbian, well, she must have a masculine characteristic. Once again, total nonsense. Total nonsense. But people buy into these stereotypes. And we need to learn as a society to reject these stereotypes. There are people in our society that subscribe to belief that homosexuality is somehow associated with a failure to fulfill traditional gender roles. That a real man is gay, therefore is not gay. Therefore, gay men are not real men, and that a real woman is not lesbian. Therefore, lesbian women are not real women. Once again, total BS. This is all rooted in a very prejudicial understanding of a heteronormative society. And we need to challenge individuals who subscribe to this very limited understanding of homosexuality. We need to correct them. So let's start talking about sexism. Sexism is the prejudice or the discrimination of an individual based on one's sex or gender. The belief that one sex or gender is superior to the other. Well, in society, what gender is considered superior? From a sexist perspective, it's males are superior to females. The idea that sexism imposes limits on what males can and should do and what females can and should do. And as we know already, I assume, sexism in society is most commonly applied against women and girls. See, what sexism does is that it seeks to maintain the patriarchal system or male domination within our society. It promotes ideological and material practices of individuals, of communities, of institutions that oppress women on the basis of gender or sex. And this oppression can take many forms. We can see social domination, for example. We can see economic deprivation as well. Sexist behaviors, conditions, and attitudes perpetuate stereotypes of social gender roles based on one's biological sex. I want you to think about sexism in action within our society. Think about Congress. We have seen a greater representation of females in Congress, but let's keep it real. There are not enough females in Congress. Females make up 51% of the American population, but they do not make up 51% of Congress. When issues related to women's health are debated, oftentimes within those boardrooms in Congress, women are excluded from the discussion. So we're making decisions about women's health without including women in that discussion. We're making decisions about abortion without having an honest conversation with women about abortion or access to birth control. See, many men in Congress fulfill what category? Older, typically north of 65 years old, white, heterosexual, and male. And so many members of Congress may assume that a woman, for example, may only want to go on birth control because she's engaged in these promiscuous sexual behaviors, not realizing that there are other medical benefits to birth control. It's a lack of knowledge. And I don't know if it's done on purpose or unintentionally, but it's a lack of knowledge. Think about a woman's right to choose. I was having this discussion with someone not too long ago about a woman's right to choose. And the person was trying to convince me that abortions have been skyrocketing since abortion became legal in the United States. I said, well, that's not necessarily true. The person tried to convince me that Planned Parenthood does nothing but abortion. I said, actually, abortions are only about 2% of what Planned Parenthood does. Planned Parenthood does a lot of prenatal care. They do a lot of medical checkups, primarily for low-income women, right? They provide educational services. They provide individuals with a plethora of information about how to have a safe pregnancy. But we have this obsession with assuming that every woman wants to have an abortion. We're not going to talk about abortion extensively in this class. It's more of a human sexuality topic. But what I want to stress is that the reason why abortion is legal in the United States is not that Democrats or liberals or progressives love abortion. That's not the case. It's this idea that prior to Roe versus Wade and the legalization of abortion in the United States, if a woman wanted to have an abortion, she would oftentimes have to go to these makeshift facilities that were unsanitary, that didn't necessarily have trained medical professionals to perform an abortion. Women would throw themselves down the stairs. Women would get wire coat hangers and insert those wire coat hangers, basically break them apart and insert the metal rod into her vagina. Women would drink these pill cocktails to try to poison and kill the fetus. Women would drink bleach, and many women died because there were not medical professionals guiding her as to how to have an abortion. They were getting creative and having abortions, back alley abortions, which was jeopardizing their health and well-being and their lives. So the argument is not about women wanting to run wild and have abortions and practice unsafe sex. The purpose of having legislation that supports a woman's right to choose is on the basis of making sure she has access to proper medical facilities and medical professionals. Now, we know that depending on what part of the country you live in, they may make having an abortion nearly impossible. And if you take a human sexuality class, they'll go into more detail about that. But just keep in mind that as men try to regulate in Congress, for example, a woman's right to choose, that is a form of sexism, trying to exert their power over something that they know nothing about. Let's keep it real. If men could carry a baby for 9 months, do you think we would have this discussion about abortion? Probably not. Abortion would continue to be legal in the United States. Now, before we go into misogyny, I want you to go back to that concept or that discussion of why do we live in a society that socializes women to wear makeup, yet in many ways frowns upon men wearing makeup. And so I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a minute. I'm going to continue to record, but I want you to share your ideas. This is where it's going to be a little more interactive. And so if you don't mind unmuting yourself, if you want to try to answer this question, if you don't mind posting in the chat, why do you believe that society encourages women to wear makeup and in many ways discourages men from wearing makeup? What is the purpose of wearing makeup within our society? Anyone have any ideas? No ideas? Okay. Well, let's dig into this.
I had.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
I was writing it, but it was taking a while. So, well, basically, just like seeing, like looking at the point of makeup and just how it's about, all about appearance and basically improving your appearance. And so one reason could be that, like kind of the idea that, like the sexist idea that basically women should be looking to improve their appearance, whether for men or just in general, and while men don't have that societal expectation to, like basically they're okay the way they look, or like along those lines. Of course there would be more to that, but that's one idea I had. Yeah.
All right, good. And you said something very important there, that men are okay the way they look, that's the message from society, right? And I want you to think about that. Makeup is there to cover flaws, to fix whatever perceived imperfections that an individual has. As one of our classmates shares in the chat, to be seen as pretty, because to be pretty means to be feminine. Well, I want you to think about this idea of fixing flaws. Is that to suggest that men are flawless? You can't really see from the screen, but I have a whole bunch of acne scars. I had really bad acne as a teenager. I could argue, based on societal expectations, that that is a flaw in my skin. But why am I not encouraged by mainstream society to put makeup on to hide those flaws? It goes back to the sexist rhetoric that men should be accepted as we are, and that women, you should essentially decorate yourself to catch the eye of a man. Incredibly sexist ideology. The idea that our value at times may be associated with physical appearance. And that in our society today, we are socialized in a way that tells a woman your worth in society is determined by your level of attractiveness. Well, for a man, once again, you're perfect with how you appear to be, with who you are. And so I'm not attacking wearing makeup or anything of that sort, to each his own. What I'm attacking is the societal structure that in many ways shames women for not wearing makeup. Think about it. Think about when you log on to Yahoo. Oh my gosh, Kim Kardashian was so brave. She went out with no makeup. Oh my gosh, all these actresses are so brave because they're not wearing makeup. Well, what's so courageous about that? Why are we telling women that they need to fix these perceived flaws? Think about plastic surgery and how plastic surgery, and I'm not against plastic surgery, so I'm giving that disclaimer. But think about how many individuals get poked and prodded while they're in a plastic surgeon's office. Have you ever seen someone get their nose done in that very brutal procedure? Tummy tucks, implants, whatever it may be. Now, if an individual's doing it because they feel that it adds to their sense of self and it makes them feel better, okay. But if they're doing it because they believe that this is what society wants them to do, that's where I take issue with that. What if you were in a relationship? And I don't know how many of you watched 90 Day Fiance. I love that show on TLC. But what if you were in a relationship with someone and there was one couple on there many seasons ago where the husband wanted, or the fiance wanted, the future wife to fix aspects of her body? Why is it that some men believe that they can manipulate women and tell women, you need to get a breast implant, you need to get, a tummy tuck, you need to get whatever it may be? But what if we were to flip the script? And if a woman was to say, okay, I'll get a breast implant if you get a penis enlargement, would that be socially acceptable? What if women started saying, you know what, babe, are you really going to wear that outside? Don't you think you should touch up your face a little bit before we walk outside? I want to make sure that you're presentable. That's flipping the script. And so we want to understand that there's nothing wrong with wearing makeup. There's only an issue when women are forced or feel obligated to do so. Right? And so I want you to keep that in mind as we go through this. And something else to keep in mind, a majority of makeup companies, a majority of female hygiene products, those companies are not run by women. Those companies are run by men. And so you want to keep that in mind. Any other thoughts on makeup before we return? And thank you, I think it was Jeremiah. Thank you for that. And Jenny, thank you for that as well. Anyone else have any ideas before we continue? And sorry, my dogs are going crazy right now, barking at, I think, the dog next door. All right, so let me go back to share screen and we'll continue with our lecture. So let's talk about misogyny. And misogyny is a very extreme form of sexist ideology. It's a hatred of women. In societies where misogyny is prevalent, we see higher rates of brutality against women. We see higher rates of domestic violence, of rapes, of the commodification, the objectification of women and their bodies. In misogynistic societies, we see women being treated as property or second-class citizens. Think about this at an institutional level. An example of misogyny is when a female rape victim might be told by a judge and a jury that she was culpable, she was responsible for her rape because of the way she was dressed. And I know this sounds absurd, but it has happened time and time again, where rape victims are told, well, why were you walking down that alley? Why did you consume too much alcohol? Why did you wear that dress that exposed a lot of your body parts? Well, there's no way he could have raped you. Your jeans were too tight, and you would have had to consent to remove those jeans. Think about the absurdity of those arguments. But those arguments are a reflection of a misogynistic society. And when we talk about sexual coercion in those 2 additional chapters next week, you'll get more examples of sexual coercion, of sexual assault, sexual violence in general. Now, let's talk about the objectification of women. And the American Psychological Association Task Force on the Sexualization of Girls found that the sexualization of women and girls is related to numerous societal problems. That sexual imagery can have adverse effects on the physical and emotional well-being of young girls. Think about how our society glorifies thinness, how our society promotes this image of the perfect body. The idea that our society is so focused on valuing women on the basis of physical appearance and not necessarily inner qualities or strength. Think about how in advertisements, we have models that exhibit this ideal definition of beauty that's nearly impossible to achieve without a tremendous amount of makeup, airbrushing, whatever it may be that they do to enhance the images. The idea that studio lighting, right, computer enhancement, they change these images, they manipulate these images. And what we want to understand is that the models that we see on TV only represent about 5% of females within our society. Let's keep it real. The average woman in American society is 5'4" and weighs 140 pounds. While the average model in advertisements is 5'11" and weighs 110 pounds. So society tells women, chase this impossible image of beauty. But how often do we tell men that? How often do we tell men, this is the perfect body. You all need to have bodies like Ronaldo. I haven't felt that pressure. So I want you to think about that. How we objectify the female body. How the media, in many ways, dehumanizes women. And it displays this artificial ideal. We turn women to a thing. Women as a thing are then dismembered to highlight their lips, their legs, their breasts, their butt, their torso. We see advertisements where we witness on a daily basis the commodification of women. The idea that the female or the female body is used to sell a product for male pleasure and consumption. The female body is a prop that is used to sell a material good. Now, I want to share with you a short commercial, and I want to discuss it a little bit. So let me stop sharing screen real quick. And I want you to think about Carl's Jr. commercials. And hopefully we have seen Carl's Jr. commercials and the sexist nature of Carl's Jr. commercials so that we can analyze it from multiple perspectives. And so I'm going to go to share screen, and hopefully everyone is able to hear it. So let me play it. You really don't need to hear the audio, just see the images, but hopefully you're able to see the audio as well. I'm sorry, hear the audio as well. So let me play it for you. So I want you to think about the absurdity of those commercials and understand that the person who makes the commercials for Carl's Jr., who shares their vision, is someone in his mid-30s. But think about how females are used as a prop. And it's not just exclusive to Carl's Jr. commercials. But think about how when you watch a UFC fight or a boxing match, women are used as props to hold up the card saying this is round whatever, right? Let me open up the discussion real quick to what we saw, other than obviously the objectification, the commodification of the female body. But what did you see specifically in this commercial from Carl's Jr.? Anyone have any ideas? What were they selling? Was Carl's Jr. selling a burger, or were they selling fantasy? You see the woman with the bacon jam dripping on her mouth, right on her chin. You see individuals eating bacon as if they're about to engage in oral sex, as if they're about to make out with one another. I mean, I make a lot of bacon for myself and for Gavin, and that's typically not the scene. Women walking around in bikinis and heels, making bacon in my kitchen, right? And the other side of me says, "Whoa, that sounds like incredibly dangerous because bacon oil burns." Right? But any thoughts on this particular commercial or any of the Carl's Jr. commercials? And it's okay if you don't express those thoughts now, but I want you to be more critical as you're consuming media and think about, what's the representation of females here? What type of message are they sending to males? We can argue in many ways that it provides a very unrealistic perspective of what females are supposed to look like, of what the female body is supposed to look like. Imagine this. As a young male, you're being fed this image and all these images of what the perfect body is. Then you hold females to impossible standards, assuming that this is a heterosexual relationship. That's not fair, because women are not expected to hold men to the exact same standards. Now, I want to show us some images related to sexism. Let's start off with this one. This is an older photo from Fox News, right? One of their roundtable discussions, or I guess couch discussions. Attractive younger women, right? Some all in heels, form-fitting dresses, shorter dresses. They're trying to get the attention of heterosexual male viewers. And for heterosexual women viewers, well, congratulations, you get Newt Gingrich in the morning, right? Or in the afternoon, whenever this was shown. Right in the middle, right? Surrounded by attractive younger females, you have an older gentleman who is clearly not as fit as these women. The idea that television shows are trying to get or to gain access to the inner teenager of grown men so that they'll watch their programs. Think about newscast. And we have Yannick Garcia on the left-hand corner. Now, this is one of the very few images that I was able to find of her that actually showed her front. Typically, they film her from an angle and focus extensively on her butt, right? Now, there's nothing wrong with wearing clothing like this. That's not the point of this discussion. The question is, are these women forced to dress in this manner with the hope of gaining a male audience? Now, if they willingly choose to dress in that manner, all power to them. But if they're told these are the options for you, well, that's where we start to take issue. How about this campaign from Victoria's Secret, The Perfect Body? Now, what they were trying to argue is that they have basically the right underwear, the right bra for any size breast. But their communication was not well thought out. The perfect body, and then you have a whole bunch of very thin, very tall, attractive models. I didn't know that they were advertising a bra here. I thought they were just showcasing models. And then to label it the perfect body. Let's look at some sexist advertisements from Van Heusen Ties. Show her it's a man's world, and you have the wife serving the man. For this bottle of ketchup, you mean a woman can open it? How about here for palm olive soap? Most men ask, is she pretty? Not, is she clever? These were advertisements in magazines and newspapers. How about this one? Blow in her face and she'll follow you anywhere if you smoke these cigarettes. How about this one? Keep up with the house while you keep down your weight. So substitute some of your meals for total cereal so that you can look good while you're cleaning the house. Look at this one from Hardee's, aka Carl's Jr. in California. Women, don't leave the kitchen. We all know a woman's place is in the home, cooking a man a delicious meal. But if you're still enjoying the bachelor's life and don't have a little miss waiting on you, then come down to Hardee's for something sloppy and hastily prepared. Sexism 101. How about this for the Pontiac Star Chief? Spread your legs, and you have a woman in the backseat. And then look at this guy's face. It's a very perverted face, right? Well, you want to think about that advertisement. How about this? A pair. This is no shape for a girl, right? And they're advertising underwear. How about this advertisement? This is the one that really shocked me. It says, becoming a donor is probably your only chance to get inside her. Using the female body to encourage individuals to be an organ donor. We have the three-way burger, which we just looked at. Look at this Hardee's ad on the left-hand side. Lick, slurp, swallow. Well, what's that supposed to illustrate? Well, basically oral sex and a male ejaculating to a woman's mouth. You have the naked burger. If anyone's ever seen that advertisement, this young woman's walking through a farmer's market. It appears that she is naked. And based on what we're seeing in this picture, well, she is naked except for these two hamburgers. We see this one from the Western Burger. If you watch this commercial for Carl's Jr., this model from Texas is literally rolling on the hood of a car. Her body's all oiled up. She's in all these different sexual positions eating a Western burger. How about the Sky Vodka ad? It looks like the woman's about to give the guy a hand job. Right. What's your O face? Apparently, this vodka makes you orgasm. How about this one? Glorifying domestic violence, the victim of beauty. We have Katy Perry, nothing fake about him. And they're not referring to pop chips. You can't remember her name in the morning? Oh, don't worry. Just put a Post-it on her forehead. This is coming from Post-it. I would have never thought Post-it would have engaged in this sexist culture. How about this one? For Tom Ford, look at Tom Ford commercials. Does it really improve their sales of a cologne by placing that cologne in between a woman's breasts? Apparently, if you wear the suit, you can look up a woman's dress. If you wear the suit, you can have her on the kitchen counter as she's in the seductive face, drinking coffee or tea, right, and her legs up in the air. If anyone remembers the bottom left-hand corner, it was a Doritos commercial. You buy the Doritos chips and a woman's clothing rips off. I've eaten a lot of Doritos in my day, and that's never once happened. How about from Burger King? It'll blow your mind. We know the color red, based on human sexuality studies, is a color that most men are attracted to. And this hamburger is about 5 to 6 inches in length, the size of the average male penis. And it looks as if she's about to give this extended hamburger a blowjob. How about this one from Max? The cleaner you are, the dirtier you get. So you're washing your body with Axe body wash, and she's putting whipped cream all over her body. Tasty. So let me ask you this question, and you don't have to, respond verbally, but just think in your mind. How many of you noticed the bag of chips on the right-hand corner first? Or how about this one on the right-hand side from Nissan? The new Nissan Leaf. The new electric toy. Yeah, this woman in a seductive position, laying on a bed of flowers, basically suggesting that her vibrator has been replaced with the Nissan Leaf. And then look good in all you do. This is a hair product, once again, glorifying, in many ways, domestic violence.